Next up, starting a month from today, families living in Massachusetts safety net shelters will need to prove they're working towards getting a job and finding long-term housing. And they'll have to reapply every month in order to stay. State lawmakers are also looking to funnel more money into state shelters and set new limits on how long families can be in them, as the influx of migrants into the state continues to overwhelm Massachusetts emergency assistance systems. GBH's State House reporter Katie Lannan joins me now with more. Katie, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So tell us more about what these new requirements are going to look like.
That's really a great question because there's been a lot of moving parts, and the big outstanding question is what it's actually going to look like in practice, right? These limits that came down from Governor Healy's office recently will apply to families staying in overflow shelter sites, right? The places that are set up at the Recreation Center in Roxbury, at the former courthouse in Cambridge, for people who are waiting for a list in the state, waiting for a bed in the state's more permanent shelter system. And the idea is that they want people to kind of divert around the shelter system, to find jobs, to find stable housing before they end up in the shelter system that families have been staying in for over a year. So that's, the question will be, once they reapply after a month, what exactly the administration looks for in terms of documentation to really prove that they're in a rehousing program, applying for jobs, taking English classes. In the case of migrants or other people who are new to the country, applying for work authorization, something to help them get settled in a different way. Meanwhile, we have the House and the Senate are each proposing to cap stays in the full shelter system at 9 months, with some possible extensions after that. So there's a few different parts in play here.
So, Katie, I'm particularly struck by the requirement that they be looking for shelter. Massachusetts has a massive housing shortage. You could be a well-established professional in the state and be having difficulties finding housing. What does it mean to expect that people who are in shelters who just arrived in the country are supposed to be trying to find that?
That's the problem, right? And that there is, for all sorts of people in Massachusetts, there's not enough housing, and the housing that we have is very expensive. So one thing that advocates have raised concerns about is how will this even be communicated with people? What if you're arriving here and you don't speak English? What resources are you going to know to seek out that can maybe help you get housing? Where are you going to connect with that? So and that's why I say we'll have to see, I guess, 2 months from now, right? The first month after it starts, what that actually looks like. Are people just going to end up back in the same situation where they don't have anywhere to go, where they're, sleeping in a terminal at Logan Airport? It really doesn't. There's not a clear answer yet for how this is going to play out amid the housing crisis that we have as a state.
So this problem isn't just continuing, it's going to get worse because we're continuing to see more inflow of people. What's the governor's plan for adapting to the fact what this is going to look like 6 months from now, much less now? Yeah,
she's been continuing to call for the federal government to step up here when it comes to immigration reform, when it comes to more funding for states like Massachusetts. What we see from the State House, particularly House Speaker Ron Mariano, has voiced a couple times now that he doesn't expect help to come, at least not until after the election, because this is an election year issue. So they don't seem to be counting on the federal government doing something anytime soon. That's why we're seeing these time limits come into play, because something, if we're spending $75 million a month on shelter right now, if the population in shelter keeps growing, it's easy to imagine those costs ballooning further.
So what are the absolute numbers we're talking about here? How many people are actually in these shelter system or part of this program?
We don't know the exact number of people because the state counts it by families. Mm-hmm. So we know that there's about 7,500 families in the shelter system. There are a few hundred more, several hundred more on a waiting list and in these emergency shelter sites. So part of the problem is that these lengths of stay in shelter are very long. There's not new room being made to match the rate that people are continuing to come into the country or are, unstably housed and losing their homes if they've been here a long time.
So just doing the math in my head, that sounds to me like around 40,000 people upper limit.
Yeah, your math's probably testing me there. I can't catch up with you quite that quickly, but the average is around 3 or 4 to family.
So in absolute terms, 40,000 people is not that many people in a state the size of Massachusetts, which mainly seems to me that this is an argument about the extraordinary scarcity of housing in the state. is this putting more pressure on the governor and this legislature to actually try and increase the supply of housing to try and help solve this problem?
Well, I'll note, too, that you know, when you take the population of the state, somewhere around 7 million, you're right that that's not a big number, but it's also way more than the shelter system had been equipped to handle, you know, even just a couple years ago. So housing production is definitely on the radar on Beacon Hill. There are different spending and borrowing measures that aim to spur it through tax credits and other incentives. This week, we actually have a hearing on a $4 billion housing bill that the governor has proposed, and that's something that lawmakers seem interested in pursuing, kind of opening up some policy and spending levers to help encourage housing production. But that's not a new problem. That's been something that has needed policy interventions for a while, and it's tough to get through on Beacon Hill. It's tough to find consensus among all sorts of stakeholders when you have people representing rural areas, urban areas, suburbs. Everyone wants a different housing solution, so it can be tough to get a housing bill through.
Okay. So I'm trying to understand what's the end game here, right? These temporary housing structures were created because we were having this problem with people sleeping in Logan Airport, because, you know, so there was a clear sort of public order problem, I guess, with people who were just being treated, who were in very difficult situations, and we don't have a way to manage it. If the pressure they're putting on them is saying we're going to push people out of the shelters if they aren't meeting these requirements, aren't we just recreating the problem that we tried to solve with them in the first place?
Yeah, I think the officials who are pushing the time limits will tell you that they've been backed into a corner, that the state spending the way it is right now isn't sustainable. We do have a law from the 1980s that guarantees shelter to certain homeless families and pregnant women. And that's something that some Republicans have pushed to change, to restrict, but that's narrowing that or winnowing it is not something that's caught on broadly with the Democrats who control the legislature. So I think it really is as you get at a tricky balance to strike, right? How do you put controls on the program while also living up to the law as it's written? I don't know that there's an easy answer to that, and I don't know that we've seen the last change to the shelter system. It's easy to imagine more coming down the pike.
So, Katie, last question. Have you spoken to the people in the shelters themselves about how they feel about these requirements and how they think it's possible to deal with this?
Yeah, I mean, the last time I would have been in one of those emergency shelters myself was a few months ago now, and you couldn't really speak to the people staying there because there was a language barrier. I only speak English, and the folks who were there had come from Haiti. So, but I do know from what I've heard from advocates, providers, that they're worried about creating that situation where people are forced out with nowhere else to go. They're worried about creating new barriers for people who have gone through trauma, who don't speak English, or whatever else the situation might be, that they're not going to know how to navigate a more complex system.
Okay, Katie, we know you'll be tracking this closely for us. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.